Okay, I believe we can officially start this round now. Hi everyone, I'm Leah, debating on the motion this House regards the transition from fixed exchange to floating in developed countries. Calling on the Prime Minister to start off this round. Hear, hear.
Hi, am I visible and audible?
Yes to both.
All right, just give me a second. POIs verbally, please. I won't be looking at the chat. All right, all right. Starting my speech in three, two, one. I've trolled far too much in this tournament. It's time to lock in. Three pieces of setup at the top of the speech. Firstly, what exactly does it look when you have a fixed exchange rate? We think likely it looks like being able to peg yourself against different countries based on the needs of your particular country, right? So if, for example, you want like to increase your exports, you're going to peg against countries like Japan or China. If perhaps you don't want to, like, you can peg against the dollar or whatever that looks like. Number two, what exactly does it look like then when you have the transition from fixed to floating, right? I think to a large extent, it means that like the central bank, like removes these sort of pegs and it allows it to float like globally or like allows it to be like fluctuating, right? I think that's quite simple, already explained in Infoslide. The third thing, lastly, just on setup, what exactly then is the metric in this debate? Because I know the motion says regrets the transition in developed countries, but I think there is reasonable justification that we're going to give you just to explain why this will happen both in developed and in developing countries, and therefore why the transition within developed countries has created far larger harms in general. But I think the secondary and like probably the underpinning metric here is just what this transition has done and why it threatens like the global economy and why it therefore creates these sort of threats to the existing economy that we just think are really, really bad, right? For substantive then, um in terms of how currency pegs reduce market volatility, right? But I think absent of a currency peg, the currencies of most economies are inherently volatile. Two reasons for this. The first is because a floating exchange rate is dependent on the global supply and demand of that currency, right? Which means that even subtle like changes in, for example, international investment or Trump imposing tariffs or future economic forecasts or investor optimism can alter exchange rates. But secondly, I think speculative hot money inflows and outflows result in rapid and unpredictable changes in currency demand. That means that investors are looking to take advantage of short-term fluctuations and variations in national interest rates or anticipated changes or shifts in the exchange rate between different currencies to often dump significant amount of capitals into nations for short periods of time, then withdraw most of all of that capital once interest or exchange rates have shifted out. These inflows of hot money then induce currency volatility. In the short term, inflows of short-term debt facilitate credit booms and increase demand for currency, causing rapid appreciation. But when money inevitably flows out, asset bubbles pop, prices collapse, and other creditors call in loans out of fear of continued economic downturn, shrinking the money supply. Importantly here, a pegged exchange rate regime solves the problem of market currency volatility because the exchange rate is fixed within a narrow margin, right? This eliminates uncertainty about future shifts in a currency's exchange rate. Given that market volatility is reduced under a fixed exchange rate system, here are three reasons why that's going to be beneficial. The first is because it boosts foreign investment, right? Foreign companies are only willing to invest in an economy or like build infrastructures like factories when they're sure of the prices that they will pay. Companies, particularly those in industries with narrow profit margins, like real estate, aren't willing to sign long-term contracts or place large orders with domestic firms because they don't know what will happen to the currency in the future. An unexpected appreciation of the currency, for example, could harm foreign companies importing from domestic suppliers by raising the price of resource inputs. A currency peg eliminates this possibility of unknown future shifts in the exchange rate, thereby courting foreign investment. Two impacts here. A, we think higher aggregate demand driven by long-term partnerships with foreign firms likely forces companies to hire more workers, right? Thus increasing like access to jobs and improving social mobility. But B, likely you have heightened demand for labor because likely this is going to increase workers' bargaining power, generating like upward pressure for wages and like working conditions and trade unions or whatever. The second reason then, because reductions in market volatility often makes lending easier and cheaper, right? Currency volatility can spell doom for foreign lenders, right? Unexpected shifts in the exchange rate can cause the value of foreign loans to plummet. Consequently, we think that foreign investors either don't lend at all or charge high interest rates to hedge against the risk of unfavorable fluctuations in the exchange rate. Two impacts here. A, we think the security provided by a peg encourages a credit boom. Foreign financial institutions lend more and at lower interest rates, which results in like just more business growth and dynamic economic expansion, right? But B, we think that sovereign debt becomes cheaper and more accessible, right? Governments are more easily able to take out large amounts of debt because investors have confidence that the currency's value won't change abruptly, thus shoring up investor optimism about buying like things like government issued bonds or like government projects, right? This facilitates large scale government financing of infrastructure progress or social programs like welfare, foreign or like FDI or things like infrastructure development, right? We think then foreign lending is the only way to do this since like largely you're just not going to have that much like money as a nation. I mean, you might have a lot of money, but like it just gives you more money to be able to do so, which just increases the scale of benefit you're able to get on our side of the house. The third reason here is that capital flight and speculatory hot money inflows are lessened, right? So foreign investors with like short time horizons or things like private equity firms often flood weak financial markets with significant quantities of capital, which means they capitalize upon like favorable future shifts in the exchange rate, right? This sort of investment only happens when the exchange rate can shift. Insofar as the currency peg fixes the exchange rate in place, foreign investors are heavily deterred from such investments. This is good because temporary streams of hot money lead to unsustainable asset bubble that inevitably burst after foreign capital leaves the economy, which results in economic devastation and painful economic readjustment. Just look at, for example, the 2008 financial crisis, like Lehman Brothers and like all of that speculative like hot money inflow outflow, which just caused economic devastation globally. Why is this argument important in the context of status quo? Two reasons. A, because you look at the international context right now, in light of the US tariffs and global strife, things like global wars, there exists a lot of speculation and uncertainty. But B, we think that developed countries are the cornerstone of the global economy, right? So therefore, actually, before I move on, I'll take any points.
So,
Y-
oo. So
Yeah.
the analysis for why local currencies on our side are volatile also apply to the currencies of other nations where you peg the value of the local currency to. So things like economic shocks in the US are obviously possible. How would you mitigate these shocks?
So the thing is, everyone is going to be pegged, right? So likely you're going to peg against a more stable currency. Even if you do have economic shocks, that's fine because in the comparative, you're still going to get affected by these different shocks. So likely on like in terms of like economic shocks, it's far like going to be symmetric. But on our side of the house, you're able to peg it against another country. So economic shocks in your own country doesn't mean too much like damage essentially, right? But the second argument then is in terms of why currency pegs increase domestic economic growth within like these developed economies, right? Inflation tends to be rampant in developed countries for a few reasons. A, because consumption is usually high, right? So you have like driven by aggregate
responses and zero unique benefit. Right now, there's been zero illustration exactly on why floating exchange rate and specifically the mechanisms behind it are going to benefit developed countries. Well, a few responses then. Firstly, LO has been incredibly dismissive so far, right? They can't just ignore the analysis on why it becomes more threatening or far worse in terms of threat to the global economy. But let's weigh this for them and say, sure, these countries thought it was necessary for you to transition towards a floating exchange rate because maybe you are uncertain about the global situation, right? They never actually explained to us why this was needed. Even if they said they would, they haven't given a lot of impact as to why this was something that was so important. What you need to weigh out then is the actual implications of these exchange rates and whether or not they create stability and sustainability, right? To which the analytical rigor from Gov is far greater than the assertions on op. But secondly, this funny response on how currencies are affected by a lot of things, so they're going to fluctuate anyway. The point of a fixed exchange rate is that you do course correction and spend money to keep the currency, right? The central bank is in charge of the exchange rate. They can peg it to another one. They have to decrease and increase the money supply. So I don't see the point of saying currencies are going to fluctuate. The point of a fixed exchange rate is going to fluctuate less. But thirdly, on how you're less vulnerable to economic shocks when you have a floating exchange rate. I don't really understand this because they didn't give a lot of mechanisms, but here's a few reasons why you're not, right? In fact, you're put in more danger when you use a floating exchange rate. Drops and rises in currency are speculative because you're not pegging it against any other currency. So, in fact, your economy is put in danger even more by floating exchange rates. If you want to talk about being vulnerable to economic shocks, I think the depreciation of your currency and something that you cannot control is something that you have to deal with and you cannot like expect and like shift it, right? Investors are going to pull out money if the Panama Canal gets stuck, which just causes your economy to implode anyway. So, I don't see the point of the example. But onto inflation then, right? Given the analysis Eitan gives you on why inflation is more likely in developed countries, here's why it's better on our side. A currency peg it limits inflation for a few reasons. Firstly, a currency peg necessitates monetary and fiscal discipline. In order to maintain the peg, governments and central banks cannot engage in irresponsible policies like quantitative easing and the mass printing of money, thus reducing the likelihood of inflation. But secondly, insofar as the rate of inflation and exchange rate are interconnected, substantial changes in inflation can influence the exchange rate. This means that in the pursuit of maintaining the peg, right, central banks must keep inflation in check. Given that currency pegs reduce inflation, there are three reasons why this is good. Firstly, inflation disproportionately harms the least privileged members of these nations. While prices go up, wages are sticky in the short run, reducing the purchasing power of the poor, making it harder to access basic necessities like food and electricity, for example. Secondly, consistently high inflation discourages saving. Right? Inflation reduces the purchasing power of people who are in society. Right? It dissuades people from building up healthy savings like rainy day funds because the money is just going to lose value in the long run. So even if that results in economic growth today, it makes long run growth harder. But onto my substantive then. We're going to tell you about how the shift towards floating exchange rates has affected developing countries, right? Number one, developing countries do like they handle fixed exchange rate systems by pegging to the currencies of developed countries. They can't peg to another country if most developed countries transition to floating because then they also become volatile. But secondly, then developing countries, some of them straight up use like the currencies of developed countries. For example, Zimbabwe, which means that they are directly affected by the floating exchange rates that the US dollar uses. But thirdly, developing countries often use the economic models of developed countries because they're developed, right? So why then is the shift towards floating exchange rates something that is worse off, and why is a fixed currency better than floating for developed countries? One, pegging currencies to export market representative currencies, increasing the competitiveness of the exports of developed countries. The economies of nations like Japan and China are export oriented, so their central banks have incentives to pursue monetary policies that maximize the competitiveness of their export sectors in order to maintain low unemployment. For instance, the Japanese central bank has done significant quantitative easing in order to devalue their currency, thus making Japanese exports cheaper for other nations to buy. When developing countries are able to peg their own currencies to these export driven currencies, they benefit from the weakness of their currencies. This boosts the competitiveness of foreign exports produced in developing countries. Therefore, firms hire more workers, purchasing power rises, and wages go up. But thirdly, currency pegs increase market diversification, right? Developing countries are often like heavily dependent upon singular industries, for example, like wood, most often in the extraction of natural resources, because developed economies have comparative advantages in the production of most goods. When nations have one dominant export industry like oil and natural gas, strong international demand for that commodity causes currency appreciation. As a consequence, nascent industries can't develop since their exports are made artificially less competitive by a stronger currency. We fix this harmful Dutch disease phenomenon by letting developing countries fix their exchange rate by pegging it to developed countries whose currencies are also fixed. Even while natural resources continue to attract widespread demand, a currency peg keeps the exchange rate constant, therefore allowing other emerging industries to develop and compete in global markets. This is exactly why Saudi Arabia pegs its currency, right? Even the Saudi oil industry is lucrative. The Saudi riyal doesn't appreciate because its value is pegged to the US dollar. Thus, currencies peg facilitate economic diversification by allowing other sectors of the economy to grow. Two impacts. Before that, any POIs?
So just to be clear, so what value do developing nations want? Is it a high value or a low value currency?
It's not about high value and low value, right? The point, as Eitan gave you just now, is about volatility. It's about exactly what they want, right? And firstly, it doesn't matter. It can be high or it can be low. What you have to do is fix the currency at a point where it doesn't shock the economy when it suddenly shoots up or shoots down, right? I think we've given you like proper analysis on why inflation is bad, but secondly, on why the depreciation of currency is also worse. On to diversification then. Diversification is good in the long term since resources like oil are unsustainable and eventually be depleted. Secondly, undiversified reliance on natural resources breeds recession because resource economies are susceptible to volatile resource price shocks like the 1973 or 1979 global oil crisis. When prices fall, resource revenues plummet, and since other industries are underdeveloped, the economy writ large falls into recession. In the counterfactual, a currency peg allows for other non-resource based export sectors to flourish, thus localizing the damage caused by resource price volatility to the natural resource sector and decreasing the likelihood of economy-wide recession. But lastly, neighboring developing countries often have weak trade relationships because of the rapid fluctuations in their currencies, right? Therefore, currency pegs are necessary because they provide certainty. Three impacts. One, increased trade boosts aggregate demand. Secondly, economic integration tends to foster political integration. But thirdly, and more importantly, increased trade makes conflicts between nations less likely on two counts. One, the economic costs of conflict go up when the nations engaged in conflict are mutually dependent on each other for supply. But secondly, corporations with vast political influence, social capital, and lobbying power have the incentive to heavily lobby against conflict. For all those reasons, we are so proud to propose.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that very fine speech, now calling on the Deputy Leader of Opposition to end the opening exchange. Hear, hear.
Am I audible? Am I audible?
Audible and visible.
Okay, I'm just arranging the order of my notes. Okay, POIs however you want. So raise hand, chat, voice. Um, yeah. Starting in 3, 2, 1, go. So Cal talks about control of the value, which is the prerequisite to claiming the benefit of stability in this debate. Because what the value of the currency is only dependent on how the extent to which states are able to control the value of the currency. Just because you have a fixed exchange in Gov does not just means that it is pegged on another thing, on another currency. They don't have fiat to assume that the value of their currency is always stable. That is something they always have to prove first. In the same way, just because you have a floating exchange on our side does not mean that it's always fluctuating and it's always volatile. Guys, that's just a term. A floating exchange basically just means that it is not pegged on any other currency that is not the local currency. It is pegged on things like gold, or the value of our currency on our side is determined on the central bank interest rate of the domestic economy or on the money supply locally and things like that. Kyle explains that on either side of the house, economic shocks can happen. But the tipping point is that on our side, states have far more control over domestic economic metrics like money supply. On their side of the house, states have to focus on the happenings of the international scene, on the domestic economy where their own currency are pegged on. So on their side of the house, they have far more variables they have to account for, and oftentimes these variables are cannot be controlled by domestic economies because they don't have direct jurisdiction towards it. So a simple case study of this is that, for example, if I am a developed state and I peg my currency on the dollar, I don't have any control over the policies of the US because political administrations change. They don't know what the interest of the central bank is. They don't know the money supply the next month or the next year. That is the kind of instability you have on their side of the house. Compare it to our side, where you also still are reliant on the central bank to dictate the interest rate and therefore the value of the currency. The difference is that that is your own central bank where you have direct control over. So if it is flexibility that OG wants, on our side, we have more flexibility because that is more direct. The
POI.
benefits of flexibility are more immediate. Go OG.
Yeah, so fixed is fixed, floating is floating. Your side of the house is dependent on the global supply and demand of your currency. So any subtle changes in the global scene means your currency is volatile as well. Explain.
So if these are developed states, either way, then probably there's a huge demand for their currency still because a lot of developing nations rely on developed states for their own currency. So if the other case line from GovBench is that some developing states at least rely on the value of the currency of their developed counterparts for things like trade and investment, that signifies that there is a huge inelastic demand for the currency of developed states, which means that on our side, the value of the currency of developed states remains stable still because there's a global demand from it coming from developing states who rely on them. That answers your question. What I next want to do is to talk about, what if CG says there are bad politicians within developed states, and therefore it is also prone to fluctuations. So the same mitigation that comes from OG can be used to fix this. Obviously, politicians have an incentive to maintain some semblance of economic stability. Otherwise, their economies are fucked. They won't gain corporate investment. But also, politicians locally have short-term electoral incentives to make sure that their people are well fed, and therefore have stable currency so that they also have stable prices of goods as well, and people don't outvote them in the next election. So that explains why locally it is still good for you to peg your currency based on the internal money supply and based on the global supply and demand. What I want to do next is talk about my paper is lost. Okay. Don't
Francis, your audio is available.
Francis,
We can't hear you.
uh,
We can't hear you. We can't
okay,
hear
hold
you.
on. I've paused your timer at around 3 minutes and 45 seconds. The last thing that I heard you say is locally it is still good for you to peg your currency. Yeah, continue whenever.
Okay, hello. Okay, I'll just, I guess,
Okay, it's better
continue.
now.
So, wait, I was trying to remember. Yeah, I think my last point was about OG is asking that the value of the currency on our side is still pegged on the global demand for that currency. But if they suggest and agree that some developing nations still demand for your currency as a developed state, then it probably suggests that global demand is inelastic, and therefore, by transitive property, the value of the local currency of developed states remains stable as well, because some countries also need that for their own economic benefits. The extension is as follows: why we have more safety net for developing nations. And I first want to do a couple of framing to lay the stage for this extension. The first is that CG is probably true that some developing nations don't peg their currencies on other developed states like the euro or the dollar, but that is just 50% of the debate. Kyle still proves that the rest who previously relied on the euro and the dollar are now better off because of floating exchange. Firstly, because those developing states are guaranteed more stability because their developed counterparts have more stable currencies because of floating exchange. But secondly, the impact of it is not just trade and investment towards developing states, but it is sustained trade and investment which is needed because developing nations often rely on developed states for goods and services because they lack their own industries. But secondly, a lot of developing nations export agricultural goods because that's their only sector that is present. On our side, uh, 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 that is present on the comparative is that on their side of the house, developed states are most prominently pegged on the dollar, which means that you always have high currency values for any other developed states developing nations will probably opt into. This means that the exported goods of developing nations are always unsellable or always uncompetitive because the mother currency to which they peg on is always high in value. But secondly, the framing is simply that the debate is not about whether or not we have corporate investment on developed states, because presumably over the course of history, developed states are the first kinds of countries who have gotten these kinds of benefits. It's because it is the citizens in developed states who have far more purchasing power, which is the reason why on the onset of history, that is where corporations invested in, which is why corporate investment to developed states, as per OG, is not the most important benefit in this debate, because probably investment there has already been saturated. In fact, empirically, you see an outflow of investment from developed states to developing nations because corporations now see developing nations as the next best business environment where they can get more money. How does optionality then fit into this extension? The reason why on their side there is a problem is because a lot of the currencies are interlinked. On their side of the house, the euro is pegged on the dollar. A lot of other developed states currencies are also pegged on the dollar, which means that if there is a problem with the US, all of these other currencies in the worst case are affected as well. The comparative is that when the US fucks up, it's not affect the value of the euro, which developing nations can use as a substitute developed state to get trade and investment from. The comparative in government bench is that all of these developed states experience some degree of economic downturn, which means that there is less options for developing states to pursue the next best mother country by which they can get trade and investment from. Very proud to oppose.
I thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition for that very fine speech. Now calling on the member of government to start the closing exchange. Hear, hear.
POS in chat. Justin hear him.
In 1971, the United States stopped pegging their currency to gold, and afterwards the neoliberal consensus emerged which said, let the markets decide. It created, therefore, an expectation globally that any decent, rich nation must be free-floating. They did this because the idea was that it was easier for investors to put money into a country if it was easier to simultaneously take it out. This observation takes out OO because they are just factually wrong. The first reason why they're wrong is because definitionally, a free-floating regime dictates that singular nations cannot unilaterally control the valuation of the exchange rate. OG is right, it's determined by capital flows and the demand for the currency. But the second reason why they're wrong is because countries can choose what they peg it to in our counterfactual. You can peg it to a lower currency or whatever the fuck, and the US is not going to fuck up because they control the global economy through printing of the money to boost the USD to a certain point. But the point of this frame is to observe two things. First, these developed nations forced the rest of the world to transition alongside them. It looked like things like the denial of IMF aid if you didn't do things like end capital controls to maintain a certain fixed currency peg. This was bad, as I'll outline later on, because many countries simply weren't ready to transition to a free-floating exchange regime. This is going to be really bad. But for developing countries that did not switch, the problem was that regional banks, hedge funds, other lending institutions only lended money to nations which had free-floating exchange rates because in those kinds of nations, it was easy for investors to pull out. But if on our side, in our comparative, if everyone didn't switch simultaneously, there would be less of a difference between the developed and the developing world with respect to how attractive is the investment, because in all of the world on our side of the house, in all nations, not a single country was the case where you could easily take your money out. Because to maintain a fixed exchange rate is to impose capital controls in a large number of instances, is to do things like buy up demand for your currency when with your foreign exchange reserves, things like that. So the first thing I want to observe in argumentation is that OG doesn't really explain why subtle changes to the extent that they occur. Why do they create a large devaluation in the currency of any nation that decides to take on this kind of thing? They also didn't prove prior why a lot of nations were going to follow suit when developed countries did that, so I've already taken it above them. But the thing to note here was that investors are indeed spooked easily, mostly because, you know, they are easily scared by like government changes, wars happening in nearby, etc. But they also often act really maliciously, such as when Soros shorted the Thai baht to make a profit. He wanted the currency of the baht to devalue. The problem then is that contagion effect is something that happens when one investor pulls out and everyone else pulls out. The reason why this happens is that investors don't want to be caught holding the bag, as it were. They fear that if they don't pull out of a country, everyone else pulls out, then the currency that they hold, like the Thai baht, remains worthless. And so the moment that one domino falls, every other domino intuitively, automatically falls within a floating exchange rate system. This is not something that happens in developed countries. That's why they were okay with the transition, because investors generally understood that even though this was a risk, that there are probably good regimes and this wouldn't happen. But for all the middle income countries like Brazil, like the rest of Latin America, like Southeast Asia, they were forced to make this transition. That domino literally did fall, causing a ridiculous devaluation of their currencies, which hobbled these sorts of nations. When these countries made this switch, there were three things that happened. First, even if this collapse didn't happen, investment fundamentally became far more short-termist and small because you always knew there was a risk that everyone else would pull out their investments, therefore causing that devaluation. So that meant that all of the middle-income countries didn't receive as much investment as in our comparative. But secondly, your economic policy was no longer yours to decide. The reason why is that even if the currency doesn't massively devalue, it usually did devalue relatively significantly over the quarters or over the years. The problem then is that countries couldn't plan for the long term. Often Latin America wanted to do things like keep the exchange rate relatively high so that they could do import substitution industrialization, but if the exchange rate suddenly fell overnight, they couldn't pursue that plan because imports suddenly became very expensive. They had to change the plans. This was bad for long-term stability, which again created further incentives for investors to get spooked and pull out their investment. But third, in the events where they did happen as a matter of historical fact, there was simply no recourse available. On our side of the house, the government could always turn to their foreign exchange reserves to defend their currency. But on their side of the house, because in a free-floating regime, that option just doesn't exist. There is no fix for this worst case, and there is a fundamentally risky proposition. Even if an outside of the house investment is always stably low, at least it is stable. The upshot of this analysis is simple. In our comparative, in a fixed exchange system, investors know that the currency can be defended. It's like banking insurance. When one domino falls, we know that we'll pick that domino back up so the other investors don't fundamentally get spooked. Obviously, this begs the question, what if you run out of foreign exchange reserves? But even in that worst case, notice that if we ran out of foreign exchange reserves and the currency plummeted anyways, this opposition needs to show why there's a further likelihood that devaluation will happen, and even in our worst case, we just get to the same exact endpoint as the opposition, so it's clearly symmetric. But the second, obviously emergency transfusions of your foreign exchange reserves broadly exist from things like the IMF and the World Bank, and thirdly, you are likely to have a lot of foreign exchange reserves because investors are putting money into your economy. Sure.
So how does the contagion effect work between developed nations and developing states?
No, bro, the developing nations were convinced to do this, and then contagion effect occurred because the free-floating regime was bad for them. And even if they didn't accept, they got less money because they were a less good source of investment because they had a fixed system where you couldn't take your money out as easily. Therefore, on our side, in our comparative, countries could plan for the long term when they had control over their currency. Notice, OG fails on multiple fronts. They don't explain why countries need their currencies to be stable. The answer is to have long-term economic planning that comes with keeping exports good or imports cheap, stuff like that. They also don't explain why instability is likely to be bad and why the global south specifically is hurt. I've given you the mechanisms here. The trade-off, therefore, we are willing to accept in CG is that the developed world took a hit. Our world looked like one where the US maintained that gold standard. They maintained the gold currency. They maintained Bretton Woods institution into the long run. Maybe the developed world couldn't profit as much, but we created a standard way and methodology of investing into the global south. They didn't need to float their currency if they weren't ready. They would remain an attractive source of investment because it was equally hard to pull your money out of every single country.
I thank the member of government for that very fine speech. Now calling on the member of opposition to start the closing off case. Hear, hear.
Can I check if you can hear me?
Audible and visible.
Okay. So I have a confession to make. I don't quite actually know what's going on, but I do know economics, so I suspect that everyone is just role-playing economists. And if you are to think from the perspective of the average reasonable voter, that person has to be cooked because there's just no way to follow through any of these analysis. So I'm going to gamble. I'm going to just do two simple things. The first thing I'll do is to give you the actual explanation as to why the prices of exchange rates change. The reason why this is important is because if I can prove to you that the rates change because they should change, then volatility as a harm does not matter. In fact, it's a good thing. The second thing is just to simply explain to you what happens when governments run out of the reserves they require to defend a currency. Because it's very strange. CG says it's okay. Intuitively, it surely cannot be okay. I'm just going to explain to you why it's actually not very okay. So firstly then, why is it the case that exchange rate changes? Exchange rate changes when you have to buy and sell the currency, usually for trade or investment. I.e., if we want to buy German cars, we first have to buy the euro to pay German companies. This increases the demand for the euro, and therefore the euro appreciates. Now, if the German car companies want to buy US steel for manufacturing, they have to sell the euro and then buy the US dollar to buy steel from the US companies. So more euro now enters the foreign exchange market because it's sold away, and therefore then the currency depreciates because there's more supply. Imports and exports are not morally good or bad, which is why a floating rate is the best balance between the people who want to buy stuff from overseas and people who want to sell stuff to overseas. And this has to be true because this is literally how the euro works. So even if you do not understand economics, just imagine what's happening in the Eurozone right now. So in the Eurozone, Germany is an export-dominant economy because it has very high-quality manufacturing. Therefore, it wants to have a low exchange rate so that German cars can be affordable and price competitive against cars from, for example, Japan or the US. However, on the flip side, Greece is an import-dominant economy because it's not self-sufficient in many resources. So it wants the exchange rate to be rather expensive so that it can buy goods from developing world more cheaply. Therefore, it's a good thing that the Eurozone floats because of the fact that it's volatile, it is responsive to the economic needs of both Germany and Greece. The rate it floats at is optimal as a balance because if it's too high, Greece is hurt, and if it's too low, Germany is hurt. So you might say, the Eurozone is a common currency. That's not the debate. It's about your domestic currency. That is true, but that's not the point. The point is, within each and every nation, there are millions of tiny Germanys and millions of tiny Greeces. So you have businesses seeking to export who will then go on to employ workers, who these workers will then live in households that they have an interest then to buy imports affordably. The bottom line is this. There's likely an optimal rate by which societal welfare can be maximized, where the number of people in the country with their needs met are the highest. That rate is the rate by which currency generally floats at, because every single action made by an economic actor within a nation directly then impacts the rate by which the exchange rate is traded at, therefore making it so that it's the optimal rate. At this point, you might ask, why not have states identify and maintain this rate and fix it at the exchange rate? This can be answered by the question, why did the developed world change from the fixed rate to the floating rate? And the answer is actually quite simple. The first is countries democratize, so it can no longer be the case that you look after the interests of the few, oftentimes businesses, in setting the interest rate at a certain degree so that they can either export a lot or buy things very cheaply depending on what their interests are. It is now important to just take into consideration the interests of everybody. But the second and more important one is, at this point, it's impossible for you to measure at what point is that actual ideal rate and fix it there. Then the reason for that is because given that everyone now participate in the economy. So it's not like the case that you have like people living in the mountains doing subsistence farming anymore. Like we try to pull as many people as possible into the factories to participate in the workforce. And all of these people have all different needs. At this point, the computation is extremely difficult. But even if it's the case that you can lock that down, the capacity for you to accurately determine to what degree can your economy change is also uncertain, because you can move forward and backwards from being an import-dominated or export-dominated economy. Neither of these things are objectively good or bad. I think, therefore, this rate is one that is optimal, and we can ensure that it's always reached without any certainty or any probability of government failure, which is potentially catastrophic. Before I go on, I'll take one from closing. So it's very strange, right? Like when you explain things simply, no one has a POI. But when you just say things, everyone has something to say. I'm just going to move on. So the reason why you have to prioritize this simple analysis, although it's just dirt simple, is because the other teams are lying to you. What they're doing is that they're taking one financial incident and deriving one way by which an economic concept contributed to that incident. But that does not automatically explain whether it's the case that the economic concept is good or bad, because we can tell you that potentially a fixed exchange rate was probably good for some developing countries, but it's also true that in the Asian financial crisis, for example, that's the reason why Thailand ran out of foreign reserves to defend the Thai baht, and then it plunges them into the Asian financial crisis. So there's no point in discussing the case studies if you just don't exactly know how the concepts interact. And I think we just explained to you very simply how the concepts interact. Basically, we just explained to you a system where the most number of people can be happy under. The second thing I'm going to explain to you is what happens when the government run out of federal reserves. It is not true that nothing happens, as per CG says. At the moment, the peso in Argentina is broken. And the reason for that is because there are two separate rates. There is the official rate that the government uses to buy imports, and then there's the unofficial rate that everyone else uses because they cannot trade and buy things through the government. The issue here is because of the fact that the government no longer have enough federal reserves, they cannot match the official rate to the unofficial rate. They cannot bump up the currency anymore. So what they do is that they restrict when can people buy things and at what price can they buy them at. I think you can infer now what is the damaging degree of the harms here. Because what that means is that when people want to buy imports, they cannot do so. When people want to sell things as export, they cannot do so. And they're all completely reliant on the Argentinian government somehow reconciling the two exchange rate, but there is actually no viable way for them to do so. So at the moment, Liew, who is like leading Argentina right now, has a plan to dollarize the currency and basically just to do away with the peso, because the peso is completely broken and stifles trade. No one wants to do businesses in Argentina given that it has two exchange rate. But he cannot do so because there are two exchange rates. You need to reconcile the exchange rate first before you dollarize. That's just not possible. Basically, the reality of failed states is very viable insofar as governments run out of federal reserves to defend the currency by which they peg at, without actually understanding whether it's the case that the currency should be there at that point of pricing or not.
I thank the member of opposition for that very fine speech. Now calling on the government whip to end the government case. Hear, hear.
Hi, can I check if I'm audible?
Audible and visible.
Thank you. I'll first respond to CO, and then OO, and then how we take it above our opening. Firstly, CO, what do they say? The first thing they say is that the rate of currency changes because it should. And I want you to recognize that this relies on the premise that market outcomes are an a priori good because it is determined by free market mechanisms like demand and supply. And just because a demand for a currency increases, that necessarily means it should appreciate and vice versa. I have two responses to this. The first thing to say is that in a free floating system, what your currency's value is dependent on its performance in the foreign exchange market, or forex, right? And performance in forex is contingent on a lot of arbitrary occurrences that are not exactly like a priori justified, as CO likes to claim, right? So it looks like the whims of rich investors that decide to game the system and buy and sell currencies as and when they please, but also looks like the whims of US presidents or presidents in other developed nations making policies like tariffs and fucking up the whole system such that the market fluctuates to that large of an extent. And here it is unclear why we should justify market outcomes just because it was determined by a free floating market. It is unclear why this is justified. But secondly, these occurrences are not market optimal outcomes for everybody, right? The intuition here is that some players are bigger than others. The US clearly has more sway in forex than a smaller country like Brazil. What is important about this? It means that not every country has control over its exchange rate as it responds to domestic policies. What CO says is that it's good that a country's currency devalues or appreciates because that is reactionary or like in reaction to certain events that happens and that outcome is good. But that's not necessarily the case, right? Because if a big player decides to do something, that will affect the currencies of a lot more other countries, and that has an extending ripple effect, which again undermines the autonomy of these countries to actually set and control their currency rates. This is why CO simply falls out of the debate. The second thing that they say is that what happens when we run out of foreign exchange reserves. They bring the example of Argentina, right? Understand that when there was artificial devaluation of the currency in Argentina, this occurred because of capital flight, because investors started pulling out their money from Argentina because they were scared to be the last one there, losing with a currency that was worth nothing. And what's important about this analysis is that this precisely occurs for the reason that Justin tells you. It is because of the transition that created the expectation that all economies should be easy to pull out of, that we should have less capital controls, that we should all operate on a free floating currency market system. This is the reason why the currencies in these countries are devalued. So once we attack that premise, the logical outcome that what if they run out of foreign reserves doesn't apply, because we prove to you that under our world this would have never happened in the first place. I'll move on to OO and their main claim. Their main claim is that floating is good for developed countries because it allows them more control over the value of their currency. I have a few things to say to this. Firstly, how do economic shocks in other external countries affect a country's domestic exchange rate? OO sells a false premise that a floating system guarantees a certain extent of insulation of the economy from external events happening. I want to prove that it is not true. Firstly, even if your currency is floating in a connected, developed economy, economy, supply chain shocks from other like external events happening like wars will still cause depreciation to your currency, right? Because a floating system is one wherein the value of the currency is determined by the market mechanism in the forex market. There are two ways in which your currency may be impacted. The first thing to say is that in a developed or connected economy, right, when there are integrated supply chains running across multiple continents, you like something happening in Russia that prevents them from exporting oil to you means that you have no factor input for your manufacturing, which means that there's a downturn in your economy, and therefore your currency also still rapidly and plummetingly depreciates, right? Or your country's currency is subject to rapid appreciation due to market forces because the Russian currency just devalues extremely far. But the impact of this is still the impact of this, therefore, is how does a fixed exchange rate economy protect against this exact harm? What we tell you is that it limits the range of variability within which your currency can fluctuate. OG says this, but they don't explain how this works, right? Understand that you can peg it to other things as opposed to just a singular currency. You can, instead of pegging it to just the US dollar, peg it to like a basket of currencies to disperse your risk across different currencies. Or you can peg it to gold reserves. That is something that falls within our side of the debate and not opposition, right? So opposition mentions the harm that perhaps you peg it too high, but clearly that's not part of this debate because countries and their financial institutions have the autonomy to select and vary the kinds of currencies they peg their currency to. So if it is too high, they can just peg it lower. It is unclear why this is necessarily a harm that accrues on our side of the house. Before I move on, I'll take a POI from opening.
Closing?
So if currencies are affected by arbitrary activities, then presumably the major currencies where developed states on your side use also experiences arbitrary outcomes. So how do countries on your side insulate themselves from potential fluctuations?
The way in which we insulate them from fluctuations is that when you peg your currency, the variability of the value of your currency is necessarily limited. The second thing to say, is that you can peg it to a basket of currencies, which is in fact what most people do. So that undercuts the impact. But more importantly, on weighing, how do we take above OO? On opposition, understand that every single event in the economy affects a country's value per forex market mechanisms. But on government, there may be a certain extent of fluctuation, but this is relatively less fluctuation, right? Because the frequency of of the USD crashing is presumably lower than the economies of basically every single economy in the world potentially having some form of some form of economic distress. Moving on to OG and how we take above them. They want to claim claim the harm of developing economies following suit and therefore suffering, but we actually explain why this is the case, right? Justin's extension tells you two things. Firstly, why the trend towards floating exchange rates in the developed world has forced developing economies to transition as well because of things like conditional monetary aid and loans by institutions like the IMF. But secondly, that even if developing economies did not make this transition, and kept the fixed exchange rate model, they are still harmed because lending institutions have had this expectation that they should be able to pull out of countries easily and they should not be subject to capital control mechanisms that exist within floating rate, fixed exchange rate societies. So why exactly is this the most important extension in this debate? It's because it explains why this transition has contributed to the lagging behind of poor and middle income countries in the era of the economic boom. And this is something that cannot be compensated over time because now investor climates are less friendly and the economy is just slowly trending towards a downturn. This was a missed opportunity for these countries to genuinely develop their economies meaningfully. Because of this transition, we have left them behind. Never been prouder to propose. Thank you.
I thank the government whip for that very fine speech, now calling on the opposition whip to finally end this semifinal. Hear, hear.
Can I check that I can be both seen and heard?
Yes to both.
Can I also double check that the recording is stopped?
I think it stopped a long time ago.
Oh, okay, that's great. Okay.
Wait, actually,